helps to know why we start down a path. So for each of you, just briefly tell us why you got into journalism and media, and B before C's. So Jenny, you can go first.
Thanks so much, Deborah, and thank you all for following us onto the Zoom lifeboat. It's good to see you all showing up one by one. Oh, there you are. Hello. Excellent. Awesome. So as some of you may have read, I started out my career as a physician. I was an ER doctor, but while I was in medical school, I was very, very fortunate to write for the state capital newspaper. I wrote a column, and the column got some attention, and I kept writing it throughout my medical training. And I loved writing. I loved working with ideas and words, and I took on a little bit of side work. And as I practiced medicine in a number of settings, I found I was just so happy working with words, and sort of gradually decided to transition from clinical practice to full-time journalism and writing. And that was about 10 years ago. And I've been very lucky to have been able to participate, even without a journalism degree, in this amazing profession. Thanks so much for having me.
We are so glad that you jumped ship and joined this great field. All right, EJ, so you start down the path of journalism, take a turn, and end up back in information. So tell us your story briefly.
Yeah, so I would to a Zoom. Let me.
Here we go. So I was that kid who dream was to work for ESPN. So I actually got a degree in journalism at the University of Oklahoma. However, also as a first generation college student, a Bill Gates scholar, I learned a lot about the inequities in education and became extremely passionate about education. So I ended up starting an ed tech company, which moved me away from journalism. I got re-inspired by journalism after listening to someone named Balaji Srinivasan, and he talked about the decentralization of media and how everyone should be a citizen journalism, which I look forward to talk more about in the forum. And so our company ended up purchasing ednews.com and an education publication site. And on the side on Sundays, I do the 817 podcast, which is about Fort Worth, and we highlight news, trends, and culture.
Okay, thank you so much, EJ, the broadcaster with a great setup. Okay, glad that you're with us, EJ. And now I want to introduce you to the new kid on the block, but definitely with decades of award-winning experience as he comes into Fort Worth to lead the new nonprofit Fort Worth Report. Chris Cobler, glad to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Deborah. It's nice to be called the new kid on the block. I like that because I grew up in a time when, if we all think back to when we all got the newspaper delivered in our driveways, my parents weren't journalists, but they were great news consumers like everyone else at that time. I devoured the morning Topeka Capital and then the evening Topeka Journal back when there were two papers being delivered in the morning and evening. And that led me as a kid to create the Cobler News and become its first publisher. I enlisted my younger sister to be the editor, and we wrote stories like Mom Kills Snake in Garden and produced other content that I learned later was just community news. That's news that's really defined my long newspaper career. There's a lot of buzzwords for it. Now people call it hyper local news. Back then it was just my sister and I having fun. But I've worked since then to try to find a business model that's as good as the Cobler News. My sister and I had no overhead. Our dad took the Cobler News we typed up to his office and made Xerox copies, back when we called them Xerox. And then we sold it. So we had no labor, printing, paper, distribution expenses. We sold the paper for 5 cents a copy to all of our family members. So we had 100% penetration in our market. Revenue went completely back to us, the journalists creating the paper. So I've been hooked on local journalism ever since. Today we call it the Fort Worth Report. So I'm happy to talk more about that and appreciate being on this panel.
Fabulous, Chris. Thank you so much and welcome. Welcome to Fort Worth. Look forward to seeing what you are able to produce. I'm not sure how much of, you all were able to hear as we were getting started, but we all love news, right? We love news. It's our profession. It's what we think about. We live and breathe it. Yet I know that I hear this, and I'm sure you all too, that some people, frankly, they turn off the news, the broadcast part of it. They don't, they're not reading papers, et cetera, et cetera. Jenny, you wrote about that, extensively in your spring issue in the TCU magazine, just kind of the precarious times that journalism is in right now. And we hear a lot these days that journalists are biased, that they, slant the truth. And we often hear that opinion when it comes to controversial topics, and there is no shortage of controversial topics right now. So I'm curious from each of you, and Chris, I think I want to start with you on this. How, you have led newsrooms, you nurture reporters, mentor reporters. How, you've been one, of course. How does a journalist cover a topic that's controversial, yet also maintain objectivity?
It's a good question, a really important discussion. I think a key part of the question is being constructive. I mean, controversy or conflict is one of the elements of news. I mean, when we wrote about mom killing a snake in the garden, it was, there was conflict there, and we probably lacked the snake's point of view in that story, I'm sure. But so we can't get away from controversy as being central to news reporting. But it's how you do it. The other key part of the question is objectivity. We're all products of our environment, and no one is truly objective. So it's really a question of how to train professional journalists handle the dual challenges of being constructive and objective. For one tried and true way that's always been there is the following the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. And the pillars of the code, I think, are worth sharing for everybody. They're really good. They're seek truth and report it, minimize harm, act independently, and be accountable and transparent. Every news site you visit should have their ethics code clearly posted. If they don't, you should be really suspicious of what's there. Another way we try to approach this at the Fort Worth Report is following the guiding principles of Solutions Journalism Network. And this approach encourages journalists to go beyond reporting of controversy. We don't want to just dump problems on all of our readers, but solutions journalism really encourages us to rebalance the news so that every day people are encouraged and exposed to stories that help them not just understand the problems, but also think about present potential ways to respond to the problems that are being reported on. So it's really a range of things, trying to report the whole story and seek out a range of possible responses. I mean, it's a lot's been written about that. I'd love to hear Jenny talk about that, because what she's done with her reporting is just tremendous in the TCU magazine you mentioned.
Yeah, Jenny, do you want to jump in to this part of the conversation now, since Chris laid out the welcome mat for you?
Thanks so much, Chris. I love what you said. I'm so happy that you brought up the SPJ Code of Ethics and the Solutions Journalism Network. And I'm also a compulsive Zoom chat note taker. I learned that at the Austin Monitor, where we had to live tweet city council, and it's just an instinct by now. So I hope nobody minds if I take a few notes. I had an amazing experience speaking with TCU journalism professors, and they had some really interesting things to say about objectivity. One of them told me straight out, there is no such thing as objectivity. As a journalist, what your job is to know your own biases and correct them. And they use the concept of fault lines, which is the idea of knowing what it means to be your particular race, gender, class, I think age, and there was one more, and there are probably others. And as a journalist, you need to know those things. I would also suggest that as a viewer or a reader or a consumer of news, it's helpful to know your own fault lines as well. To be able to recognize whose voices maybe are being elevated, whose are not being heard, in order to be a little more able to spot potential biases, which journalists, we all have, for sure. Too often, objectivity is used as a shorthand for one particular point of view, typically a middle-class white male kind of historic journalistic point of view that tends to have dominated newsrooms for decades. And that's not to say those journalists cannot be reasonably objective. They certainly can, but it's also really important to get other points of view in there and to, again, ensure and underscore the idea that everybody knows whatever their biases are that they're coming in with.
All right, EJ, let's bring you into the conversation now. I'm sure that this is also something that you tackle in the 817 podcast, and maybe perhaps is it pushed you to be another form of information for folks?
Yeah. One, I think what Chris and Jenny said is really spot on. I think the note here, the 817 podcast, I think the first step is to kind of showcase the difference between, is helping people understand the difference between journalism and media. And so the 817 podcast is definitely more media, personality, entertaining interpretation of news from a point of view. And I think that's kind of a really big start there, is just like understanding AP journalism, knowing, the difference between AP news and Reuters compared to the things that we might have on TV. And so that's kind of, I think, like the big step. And I think a lot of people, the next big step is, I think, something called citizen journalism, which I learned from a technocrat named Balaji Srinivasan. And he basically said that corporate journalism is a job, social media is a hobby, and citizen journalism is your duty. And I think if you can get everyone to write 3 good stories, may not make a lot of money or make any money, but everyone's experts in different ways, and being able to decentralize where people get that information and really kind of keep everyone accountable. I think that would be really cool, to empower more people to be journalists. And then I guess my final point would be, is we need to change the narrative on journalism as how do we get more people to fund the Fort Worth Report and these kind of things, to see high quality journalism, like high quality produce, right? We spend a lot of money at Central Market. How do we convince those same people to feed their brain with high journalism from like the Fort Worth Report? So I think those are kind of the 3 challenges that I see.
Well, I hope, I mean, of course, I would love for everybody to watch NBC5, but EJ, I would hope that in the 817 podcast with your audience, you are encouraging people to check out the Fort Worth Report and see what it has to offer.
Yep. Yeah. And I think it's a lot like sometimes the tough part about reading the facts is, okay, so what does it mean? I mean, if you're reading something about the census report that just came out, and now you get 2 seats, for an average American, you might be like, can you speak first grade English to me? And I think a lot of podcasts and our styles, like, what does that mean to, an average Fort Worthian who's minority, 30 years old? What does that even mean? So I think those are kind of the opportunities where media can play honestly with factual journalism.
Yeah, it's almost like how we've taken the Bible, written, so many centuries ago, and made it a little more speak. I know we've talked about some questions, Chris, Jenny, and EJ, but I do want to jump into something now that one of our audience members has asked, because I think it's important, and I'd like for you all to address it. And that is, the public talks about fake news. How do you feel about that as a journalist? We know there is definitely fake news out there, but not everyone is involved in that. Chris, would you like to start?
You want me to start, Deborah? I didn't quite hear that.
Yes, if you would, you want to tackle this question from Colleen?
Sure. Fake news is, it's definitely the buzzword out there, and it's definitely true. I mean, I think it's more challenging than ever in my lifetime to be an educated news consumer. I mean, fake news can be what your crazy cousin posts on Facebook, or it can be just the blurring of news, commentary, and entertainment. I mean, that we see all the time everywhere we turn. So I think the important thing is, it's so challenging to be an educated news consumer, but it's so important to do that. Don't just share that link from your crazy cousin on Facebook if you don't really know what's behind it, and if it's coming from a verified news site that lists its principles, its guiding principles. There's lots of efforts around the country trying to help news consumers. One's the News Literacy Project. It's a national education nonprofit that provides training and resources for educators and the public. At the Fort Worth Report, much closer to home, that's our whole mission is about this. As a nonprofit and nonpartisan news site, we don't have an editorial board. We don't run editorial board opinions endorsing candidates and things like you might see on an opinion page. We leave that to, smart people like EJ and others to offer opinions about the news that we provide. But we think it's just so critical to have people feel like fact-based local journalism is what they can count on. And so that's that's really what we do. And I just would encourage people to not just only support us, but just support everybody who's providing local journalism. It's so vital to our democracy, to our community.
I want to bring Jenny into this conversation before we move on to the next topic, because I mean, Chris brought up a really good point there, Jenny. It is challenging to be an educated news consumer. I mean, we are in the business and have to fact check this and fact check that. So what do you find are good resources that you can offer people so that when they see something or hear something that they can, know where to go to check it out? And then if they're having a conversation with someone, be able to thoughtfully share what they've learned from one of these credible sources?
That's a really good question. And there are many of them. The News Literacy Project, definitely. Pointer, I'll put it in the chat, is another resource. Nieman Labs and Pew. These are things that a lot of journalists themselves turn to, but there's no reason that people couldn't go and get a little media literacy education. I wanted to suggest, we live in a news environment that I love EJ's analogy, comparing it to food. It's as if, we have Kraft, kind of American cheese product news. No offense to Kraft, but it's not necessarily the Vermont dairy, artisanal cheese made by your neighbor down the road, which is, grass-fed, etc. It's hard. We just can't assume that what we're getting is the most nourishing to our brains. I would say people need to learn to choose their news as they choose their food. A very quick list of 5 questions for media literacy when people are looking at news. Ask yourself, who sent this message? What techniques are they using to attract my attention? Such as a really splashy, illustration, for example, or a really angry, opinionated sounding journalist who really gets your attention, or commentator who really gets your attention. Third question, how might other people understand this message differently from how I understand this message? Just kind of try to jump into, what would a listener not like me hear? What is being omitted from this message and what is being represented? Which values, lifestyles, points of views are coming up and which are not? Who's not here, in other words? Who's not here in this news message? And why was this message sent? Because all media messages are arguably organized for a certain reason. These are not my questions. I found them somewhere, and I actually put them, I literally have it written down because I find it so helpful to have it in front of me. But it's something we all have to learn, including journalists. And it's not easy for consumers, and I can see why there's some mistrust out there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I want to go back. I want to touch on one of those points, Jenny, now, and that is, when you're looking at the messaging, whose voice is missing? From whom are we not hearing? Kind of evaluate what newsrooms are doing, maybe put a grade on newsrooms that you have found when it comes to including diverse voices, and both, hearing from the underrepresented and putting this diversity as spokespeople for products, as the ones telling the story, because sometimes I'm going to get a better interview from somebody who, looks like me, who's in that community than I would when I'm from outside of a community.
Sorry, are you asking me?
Yes, I'm sorry.
I was typing the messages in. Would you repeat the question really quickly?
Yes,
I'm so sorry.
I'm curious about diversity in newsrooms, and you find they're providing that platform for diverse voices and misrepresented.
This is a hugely important question. It's central to whether we can trust the news. It's central to whether the news are presented in an ethical way. And I have a wonderful example, a couple of wonderful examples from the folks that I interviewed for my story. Jean Marie Brown is a journalist of color at TCU, teaching at TCU, and she told me this really intense story of being in Chicago, and the newsroom was reporting on a fire that killed a grandfather and a grandchild. And her newsroom was a very white middle-class newsroom, and the journalists in the newsroom were up in arms saying, where were the parents? Why were these children with their grandparents? And Professor Brown realized that in this newsroom, the norm was that these women, it was mostly, I guess, a male newsroom, and the women stayed home when they had their babies. And that just isn't necessarily normal in other communities. But these journalists didn't see it. And Professor Brown did see it. This is part of the fault lines situation, and she used this. I love this example. Another journalist, Jordan Rubio of the Houston Chronicle, a data journalist, told me, if you're reporting on a low-income community with low-performing schools, if you don't mention the context, for example, a legacy of disinvestment in that neighborhood, a legacy of redlining, then you're not telling the truth in a way. You're really not. You have to have that context. And unless you know your fault lines as a journalist, you're not going to be able to represent that context. You've got to have people from other walks of life in your newsroom, or the story will not be a complete, full story, a true story.
Yeah, thank you, Janie. And EJ, my guess is that there was a lack of representation that brought you to the 817 podcast and to be a voice.
Yeah. One, Jenny, you're incredible. I'm so thankful to be on this panel with you. Yeah, for me, I came back to journalism. I have a full-time job, not being a journalist. And I would say I'm more of a podcaster. Media was that I think Fort Worth is in a fragile time where we have like a traditional narrative of ourselves, Cowtown, West, modern West, and just this gape of missing minority representation in our media, but then also just a fresher look of like the urban life of Fort Worth. And so I just felt really called to help tell that story of Fort Worth, and really help show all cases of Fort Worth and connect with people I feel like who listen to podcasts. I think a lot of the issue too is young people don't read newspapers, don't read the news, but they might multitask with podcasts while folding clothes or washing dishes. So this idea of how could you do the work for them and then them see it as an ROI where, hey, they're, we put in a good 10 hours a week of reading the news and then break it into a 45-minute show. So you're able to get the meat and potatoes in a swift way, but then we do provide a lot of confrontation. We do endorse, but I think the friction is there on the sense of authenticity of you want to also, if 500 people think you're credible or smart, I think that's, if Bill Gates says something to me, I respect that. My respecters are Malcolm Gladwell, Yuval Noah Harari, all these different people who I'm not that smart. So if they are saying something that's good for the world, it allows me to feel comfort on the tough decisions I have to make. And so diversifying your POVs and who you're getting it from. And I'm just glad that 817 podcast can be a POV of the subset of POVs people might have in Fort Worth.
Yeah, that's true. When you diversify your point of view, you do feel like you get a more well-rounded interpretation of what's going on, a more well-rounded education. Chris, I want you to talk about this issue.
I agree completely with what EJ said about, I've heard from a lot of people as I've been out on my listening tour to hear what's important in Fort Worth, and the diversity of Fort Worth is so important and rich. And I think it is a pivotal time to have that reflected in the news coverage. And I agree completely with what Jenny was saying about how newsrooms have clearly fallen far short when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we can't adequately cover community if we don't have a newsroom that reflects the people we serve. And I appreciate you brought up the Maynard Institute, because that's a great resource for pushing back against the systemic lack of diversity in the news industry. And the fault lines training, which I've been lucky enough to go through, is really important. I mean, it helps journalists think about the personal bias that we all have, race, gender, sexual orientation, generation, geography, class. I think class is a really important one too. They're all important ones, but we don't talk about that a lot in terms of, income inequality and differences that we all bring to the equation. I was, along with having that fault line training, Dory Maynard, I was lucky enough to know her and have her come do a training in our newsroom. And I was lucky enough to be part of the Maynard Media Academy. So it's really an issue really near and dear to me. And at the Fort Worth Report, it's in our mission statement that we need to tell all of our readers' stories and listen to them and make sure they're all valued and understood. I mean, if there's the only way we can really be successful is if we build that trust and serve the community with that brand of trusted local journalism that I think my family would they trusted the Cobler News, but if we're not part of the family, and a family of Fort Worth, then they won't trust us. And I get that. I understand why that is.
I want to take this conversation a little bit further with you, Chris, because you are starting up, a new newsroom, so to speak. I would assume you're in the hiring phase. Perhaps you've already hired your staff. But what is your newsroom, so to speak, going to look like? How have you put into practice some of those lessons that you've learned throughout your career about diversity?
Sure, we're starting small. I mean, and as I said, we need the support to get there to do, and I think EJ made that reference that hopefully people want to support the broccoli and not just the dessert, right? So we have a staff of 6 right now in our newsroom. We have our managing editor is Thomas Martinez, really talented journalist who I've worked with a number of years. Just really strong at local journalism and caring about these issues that we're talking about. He's leading our newsroom. Another one of our leaders, our chief development officer, who's very important to raise the money to keep expanding our journalism, is Trish Rodriguez-Terrell. She was the features editor at the Star Telegram before she went and did a lot of work in the nonprofit and advertising and health fields. And then our 3 reporters that we have right now. And one is the Tish Basnet, who was born in Nepal, UT Arlington grad, who just loves journalism and talks about the importance to him and to his community beautifully. Jessica Priest is a former USA Today investigative reporter who's just joined us, and we're really thrilled to have her with us. And then Jacob Sanchez is a reporter who comes from us from Temple, really strong local community journalism background that he has too. So we're being very intentional to try to have a diverse staff. We've got a lot of ways to go. Hopefully more hiring to do. We're just got funding, a word about funding for 3 interns this summer. So we're going to be looking intentionally for a good diverse group to hire. And we're hoping to have more news about other funding for other positions soon. So that's where we're started. I mean, I think when you try to hire, it's not at all about lowering your standards. Sometimes I think diversity has gotten a bad rap because they think you're lowering your standards, somehow diversify your staff, and that's not what it's about. It's about expanding your search and trying to hire people who don't look like you or think like you, just looking farther, looking wider. And it's too easy to hire people who just look like you. We're all more comfortable with that, but that's not how you hire for success.
Yeah, you make some really great points there, Chris. I know there's been lots of conversations here at the greater NBC about diversifying staff, bringing more women into newsrooms, bringing more journalists of color. Not looking at maybe larger markets to feed the pipeline. Let's look into other areas where people can bring experience. I mean, look at Jenny Blair. I mean, look at Jenny. I mean, she's going to go off and be an MD, and then she falls in love with journalism. Oh my gosh! And look, she is like the rock star on the chat and the note taking. So we have to look in other circles, and I applaud you for taking that effort that you do. We're wanting to keep folks definitely on the time link that we promised. So as we kind of end this conversation, I'd like to hear closing thoughts from each of you. And Chris, you're the one I'm seeing in full view in my screen. So take it away, sir.
Okay. Well, I just appreciate everybody tuning in, and we see the Fort Worth Report and other efforts like this. We're part of the Institute for Nonprofit News that are happening across the country as just really a critical path, and hope everybody will go to fortworthreport.org and check us out. And you also should check out the article that Jenny wrote on the state of the news media if you really want to understand how broken the print newspaper model is. It just, those days are numbered. And so but the need for what newspapers have provided in the communities and for our democracy is greater than ever. Our country is more polarized and more adrift than any time in my lifetime, because people don't trust their government and they don't trust the journalism enshrined in the First Amendment. We can't let that happen to Fort Worth and Tarrant County. We've got to support local journalism to make sure the community is informed and engaged and empowered. So I'll just stop with that. But I just want to say local journalism is so central to civic engagement that produces a healthy community. It's not nice to have. It's a have to have for our community and our country to work.
I can't help but tear up, Chris, because it's my life's work. It's what I wanted to do, and there has to be a place for it. So thank you very much. All right, EJ, let's bring you in, our 817 podcaster. Final thoughts from you, sir.
Yeah, just I think going to like everyone on the pod, on the Zoom, every single one of us is a journalist at heart. I feel like as a duty to be accountable, to do our own news as well. And I think for me, I'm more of a marketer than a journalist, a natural entrepreneur. So I think of, how do we make this cool again, right? How do we bring it back like the vinyl, right? How did the vinyl get a comeback, right? The hipsters are buying vinyl records. How do we make this thing cooler? And so I think that's a moment, is how do we tell the journalism story? And I think what the 817 podcast wants to be is a hip advocate. I go everywhere I go with the newspaper, and hanging out with my friends of color, my aunts and my nieces and nephews. How do you make information cool? And so to help support Fort Worth Report and Deborah, I think it takes us as a community to showcase the power of information and how it's like the farmer's market, but in our brain, and how do we really support that? And so that's just like my big thing. My final thing is also, if you're going to meet someone with friction, you have to come with a news source that is neutral, right? So, my dad watches Fox. I can't come with a New York Times report, even though New York Times is great journalism. So I come with him with Wall Street Journal, right, which is owned by Murdoch. I can come to him with a different source. And I think there's a power of that, of how do we get off the edges and then meet people? And it's really a combination match. And when we have conversations and constructive conversations, is how do you meet the narrative of what's the right card to lay down when you're having these discussions? So that's my other take.
All right. Thank you so much, EJ. And to you, Jenny, our final words from you.
Okay, thanks so much. Again, I keep echoing EJ. I love his food metaphors so much. I am every year when I can, I get a few hours a week job at a farm, because it's really important for me to understand where my food comes from. Try citizen journalism, give it a shot. You can jump right in. You can do it on Twitter. You can show up at the scene of something happening and stream it on Facebook and add some commentary. Keep choosing your news the way you choose your food. Look for the words local, independent, nonprofit newsrooms when you're choosing news sources. I love the New York Times as much as everyone else, but look for stuff like the Fort Worth Report. Look for local commentators, local voices who know what's happening on the ground, like EJ. This is broccoli's delicious. I don't know about y'all. Look for the broccoli. It's good. And thanks so much. Really so grateful to be on this amazing conversation with everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jenny. Appreciate it. I know that a mixed audience who is with us this afternoon. Those of us who've been through Leadership Fort Worth, we have some college students with us. I hope wherever you're coming from, that you feel like that the last hour has been time well spent. I leave you with this: a journalism for the college students out there. A journalism major should have a passion for interviewing people, for writing and reporting and delivering the truth. And we have heard from truth tellers this afternoon. Chris Cobler, thank you. EJ Carrion, thank you so much. Jenny, thank you for your conversation, both verbally and through the note taking. We will study what you have said. Thank you for inviting me to be the moderator for this important discussion. And with that, Jennifer, I turn it back over to you.
Deborah, thank you so much. Panelists, you guys just exceeded my expectations. When you put together groups like this, sometimes you don't know what you're going to get, and you exceeded my expectations. And I wanted to get you all together again. We need to do a part 2 at some point. So I hope that your experience was well worth it too. And it seemed like you guys enjoyed the discussion. And I see Jenny says food. Yes, I think we can maybe get to a point where we can do it in person even, and do some food and some other things as well. So again, my name is Jennifer Trevino. I'm the Executive Director of Leadership Fort Worth. Had the privilege of stepping into this role back in January, and so thankful that you toughed it out with us today despite technology challenges. And so again, just want to thank you all on behalf of our board president, Ramon Guajardo Jr., and all of our Leadership Fort Worth board members. Martha Erngy, who is the woman who helped put this whole event together. She is the chair of our Leadership Forum committee. She and her team have been working with us really closely to plan today's session, so we hope you like it. Along those lines, you will be seeing a survey to give us some feedback on what else you want to see in the future too. So without further ado, again, want to thank our sponsors, our speakers, but I have some door prizes for you all. So just by being here, you get to get some swag. And Tiffany was gracious enough to do some behind the scenes work for me. So we have 2 gift cards from 2 of my Fort Worth favorite coffee shops. I have a passion for coffee, as many of you probably do as well. And so we have a gift card from Crude, which is a Crude Craft coffee bar owned by Corey and his mother, Teresa, on South Main Street for $20. We also have a gift card to Black Coffee, another one of my favorites, owned by Mia Moss over by Texas Wesleyan University. And so those gift cards, Crude will be going to Megan English, and Black Coffee will be going to Ferpa Gissing. I believe I've said that right. I looked it up, but if I didn't, I apologize. We will follow up with you in email to get those gift cards to you guys. Thank you all so much again. We work, Clear Fork, we couldn't do it without you. All of our Leadership Fort Worth members, we couldn't do this work without you. Thanks so much for being part of this great discussion today. And as the clock strikes 1, I'm going to bid you all farewell. Have a good afternoon and hope to see you again soon in person. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Love it. Woo. Deborah, thank you. You are